I know you're out there, you coward. Grimwald's voice boomed through the darkness, his expensive boots clicking against stone as he stepped over the broken glass. Leave my wife alone, or I'll see you hanging from the nearest tree, Kalen pressed, his back against the rough wood of the trough, clutching the undelivered letter that had cost him everything to write. Inside the folded paper lay words he could never speak aloud, declarations of love for Vesper Nightingale, the woman who'd been sold like chattel to pay her father's gambling debts. 3 months ago, the woman who haunted his dreams and made his days feel hollow as dried husks. Check behind the trough, Grimwald ordered. And Kalen heard the metallic click of hammers being pulled back. He closed his eyes and thought of Vesper's face. The last time he'd seen her free dancing at the Harvest Festival, her copper hair catching firelight like burnished gold, her laugh bright enough to outshine the stars. That was before her father, Henrik Nightingale, had lost the family farm in a single catastrophic poker game. Before Grimwald had offered to settle the debt, in exchange for Vesper's hand in marriage, before she'd been bartered away like a prize. Hefford, the footsteps grew closer, and Kalen knew he had seconds before discovery would mean death or worse. Capture and public humiliation that would destroy any chance of continuing his secret correspondence with the woman he loved. That's when salvation came from an unexpected source. What's all this racket about? Sheriff Tobias Blackthorn's gruff voice cut through the tension as his heavy footsteps approached the alley. Grimwald, what are you doing prowling around with armed men at this hour? Sheriff, thank God you're here. Grimwald's voice took on the smooth, oily tone he used when addressing town officials. Someone's been terrorizing my wife with anonymous letters. Love notes from some besotted fool who can't accept that she's a married woman. Love notes. Blackthorn's tone carried amusement rather than concern. That's what's got you out here with enough firepower to start a war? These aren't harmless romantic gestures, Grimwald snapped. They're threats to the sanctity of my marriage, attempts to seduce my wife away from her lawful husband. From his hiding place, Kalen could hear the sheriff's skeptical snort. He'd known Blackthorn since childhood. The lawman had no love for bullies, especially wealthy ones who threw their weight around. Well, I don't see any phantom letter writers now, Blackthorn said dryly. Maybe you should focus more on making your wife happy and less on hunting shadows in alleys. As the men's voices faded and their footsteps retreated, Kalen remained motionless for another 10 minutes before finally emerging from his hiding place. The broken lantern lay scattered across the stones, another casualty in his impossible campaign to reach the woman he loved. But the letter remained intact, and that was all that mattered. An hour later, he stood beneath Vesper's bedroom window. In the imposing, grim-walled mansion, a new lantern flickering in his hands. 3 quick flashes. Pause. 2 long ones. Pause. 3 quick again, the code they'd developed over weeks of clandestine communication. The curtain moved slightly, and he saw her silhouette against the lamplight inside. Even from this distance, even reduced to shadow and suggestion. The sight of her made his chest tight with longing. A small object dropped from the window-awaited handkerchief that landed softly in the flower bed below. Kalen retrieved it, quickly finding her response wrapped inside. My dearest Cave, they suspect something. Mordecai watches me constantly now, reads my mail, questions the servants about my activities. I fear this may be our last correspondence. Please don't risk yourself further for someone who can never be yours. The words hit him like physical blows, but it was the tear stains on the paper that nearly brought him to his knees. Crying when she wrote this, his brave, beautiful Vesper was trapped in a loveless marriage to a man who collected wives like other men collected livestock. He pulled out his pencil and wrote his response on the back of her note. His handwriting, bold and urgent in the lantern light. Beloved Vi would risk everything for you because you are everything to me. Love doesn't die just because lawyers draw up papers. I'll find a way to free you from this cage. I swear it on my life. Never give up hope. Forever yours. Kay wrapped the note around a small stone and threw it accurately through her window, watching as she caught it with practiced ease. For a moment, their eyes met across the darkness, and he saw her press the paper to her heart before stepping back into the shadows. as Kalen made his way back through the sleeping town, past the sheriff's office and the saloon where Henrik Nightingale had traded his daughter's happiness for one more hand of cards. He made a decision that would change everything. If Grimwald wanted to play dangerous games, then dangerous games he would get. But this phantom letter writer wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. Some loves were worth fighting for, even if the battle seemed impossible. Especially then, the explosion that rocked. Grimwald's private office at dawn sent papers flying like startled birds and rattled windows 3 blocks away. Kalen watched from his vantage point on the hillside above town, satisfaction warming his chest as he saw the banker stumble from his building, stained and furious. It had taken him 2 weeks to perfect the mixture, just enough black powder to destroy Grimwald's private files without actually harming anyone. The blast had been timed perfectly, 30 minutes before the bank opened, ensuring no innocent people would be caught in the chaos. But the real message lay in what the explosion had revealed. Scattered across Main Street were hundreds of papers, documenting Grimwald's illegal activities, loan sharking, property theft, bribes to local officials, and most damning of all, detailed records of the rigged poker game that had bankrupted Henrik Nightingale. "Someone's playing a very dangerous game," Sheriff Blackthorne observed as he surveyed the destruction, his weathered face thoughtful as he examined one of the scattered documents. This was an act of terrorism, Grimwald raged, his usually pristine appearance disheveled and wild. "I demand you arrest every man in this county until you find the culprit." Based on what evidence? Blackthorne's tone was mild, but his eyes were sharp as he held up a paper detailing bribes paid to the previous sheriff. "Seems to me like someone's doing the law's work for us." That afternoon, Kalen received an unexpected visitor at his ranch. Vesper arrived in Grimwald's carriage, accompanied by 2 of his bodyguards, her face pale but determined beneath her fashionable hat. "Mrs. Grimwald," Kalen said formally, though every fiber of his being screamed to pull her into his arms. "What do I owe this honor?" "My husband sent me to make you an offer," she replied, her voice carefully controlled. But her eyes, those magnificent amber eyes that had haunted his dreams, told a different story. They held a message meant only for him. "I had to see you. I'm listening." One of the bodyguards stepped forward, a mountain of a man named Briggs, who'd terrorized the county for years. "Mr. Grimwald knows you've been sniffing around his property at night. He's willing to overlook your trespassing if you sell him your ranch for a fair price and leave the territory." Kellen's ranch was worth $20,000. He'd built it from nothing after returning from the war, turning worthless scrubland into prime cattle country through years of backbreaking work. "And if I refuse..." Briggs's hand moved to his gun. "An accidents start happening. Cattle get sick, barns catch fire, good men disappear in the night, I see." Kellen's voice remained calm, but inside his mind was racing. He looked at Vesper, seeing the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. "And you, Mrs. Grimwald? What's your opinion on this generous offer?" "I think," she said carefully, "that a wise man knows when he's beaten." She stepped closer, ostensibly to examine his ranch house, but her movement brought her within arm's reach. As she passed him, she pressed something small into his palm. Some battles can't be won through direct confrontation. The object was a brass button from her dress, but wrapped around it was a tiny slip of paper, palmed it expertly years of covert operations during the war serving him well. "Tell your husband I need time to consider his offer," Kalen said finally. "A man doesn't abandon his life's work without careful thought. Mr. Grimwald is not a patient man," Briggs warned. "Then he'll have to learn patience, won't he?" After they left, Kalen unfolded Vesper's hidden message. Her handwriting was tiny but precise. "Mordecai suspects you were behind the explosion. He's planning something terrible. There's a secret room behind his office fireplace documents that could destroy him. But beware, he's hired killers from Kansas City. All my love, by that night." Kalen made his way through the town's back alleys with the expertise of a man who'd spent years moving unseen behind enemy lines. The bank building loomed against the starlit sky, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Getting inside proved easier than expected. Grimwald's security was designed to keep people out during business hours, not to stop a determined man with military training from entering after midnight. Kalen picked the back door lock with tools he'd hoped never to use again, slipping inside like a ghost. The private office still reeked of sulfur and burned paper from the morning's explosion, working by touch more than sight. Kalen found the fireplace and began examining the stonework for hidden mechanisms. It took him 20 minutes to locate the concealed lever, and when he did, a section of the wall swung inward to reveal a space that made his blood run cold. The hidden room contained more than just incriminating documents. Hanging on the walls were detailed maps of every ranch and farm in the county, each marked with notations about vulnerabilities, debts, and acquisition opportunities. But most disturbing were the personal files on prominent citizens, including a thick folder labeled Vesper Nightingale Grimwald that contained intimate details about her daily routines, her fears, and disturbingly, her relationship with her mysterious correspondent. Grimwald hadn't just married Vesper for her beauty or her father's debt. He'd been watching her for months, planning her acquisition like a military campaign. But it was the final discovery that made Kellen's hands shake with rage. In a locked strongbox, he found documentation of Grimwald's previous marriages, 3 of them, each to a young woman from a financially desperate family. Each marriage had lasted less than 2 years before the wives had died in tragic accidents. Vesper wasn't Grimwald's first victim. She was simply the latest in a pattern of predation that had been going on for years. As Kalen photographed the documents with his portable camera, another skill from his military days, he realized that his lantern messages weren't just about love anymore. They were about survival. If he didn't find a way to expose Grimwald soon, Vesper would become another tragic accident in the banker's collection. He was still examining the files when he heard the telltale creak of floorboards. In the outer office, someone was coming, and he was trapped in a room with only one exit. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. Grimwald had returned, and he wasn't alone. The voices in the outer office were clearer and Grimwald's cultured, tones mixing with the rougher accents of hired killers. Kalen pressed himself against the wall beside the hidden door, his army training taking over as he calculated distances, angles, and his chances of survival. "Rancher's getting too bold," Grimwald was saying. "First the explosion, now someone's been asking questions about my previous wives. It's time to end this permanently. You want us to make it look like an accident?" The speaker had a Kansas accent, thick as molasses and twice as dark. "A tragic fire, I think. Ranch houses burn so easily, especially when the owner's trapped inside. Make sure there's nothing left to investigate." Kellen's jaw clenched as he realized they were planning to murder him tonight. But it was Grimwald's next words that made his blood turn to ice water. "And my dear wife has become ... difficult lately. Asking too many questions about my business affairs, expressing inappropriate sympathy for certain local ranchers. I think it's time for her to join her predecessor in an early grave. Same method as before? Laudanum overdose, but make it subtle. Grieving widows often turn to medication for comfort. After all, wait exactly 1 week after the rancher dies. We don't want anyone connecting the two events." From his hiding place, Kalen could see Grimwald through the crack where the door met the wall. The banker was standing beside his damaged desk, his face illuminated by lamplight, looking like the devil planning his next harvest of souls. "What about that sheriff? He's been sniffing around the explosion site, asking uncomfortable questions." "Blackthorns. An honest fool, but he's not stupid. Once the rancher's dead and my wife has her tragic accident, he'll assume the phantom letter writer gave up and moved on. Case closed, justice served." The casual way Grimwald discussed murder made Kellen's trigger finger itch for the Colt .45 he'd left at home. But killing Grimwald now would only make him a fugitive, leaving Vesper defenseless against whatever backup plan the banker surely had in place. "Boss, what if the rancher don't cooperate? What if he fights back?" Grimwald's laugh was cold as winter. "When Kalen Thornwick is a war hero, not a businessman. Thinks honor and courage can overcome money and influence. He'll face his killers head-on, like the noble fool he is, never suspecting the real trap, which is, while you're burning down his ranch, I'll be hosting a dinner party with half the town council as witnesses when his charred body is found." Everyone will assume it was tragic accident, a lantern knocked over, perhaps, or a spark from the fireplace. My grief-stricken wife will be safely sedated in her room, unable to cause any further trouble. The killers left through the front door, their spurs jingling like death bells in the night air. Grimwald remained behind, apparently reviewing some papers by lamplight. Kalen knew this might be his only chance to escape undetected, moving with the silence that had kept him alive through 3 years of war. He slipped from the hidden room and made his way toward the back exit. But as he passed Grimwald's desk, something caught his telegraph message that had arrived that afternoon. Kansas City Marshal. Investigating missing persons reports. Stop 3 young women disappeared after marrying local banker stop sending. Deputy to investigate stop arrive tomorrow. Grimwald had seen it too. That's why he was moving up his timeline, why tonight had to be the night for multiple murders. The law was finally closing in, and he needed to eliminate all witnesses before morning set. So, pocketed the telegraph and made his escape. But instead of heading home, he rode hard toward the Grimwald mansion. If the banker's timeline had accelerated, then his own plans had to change as well. He reached Vesper's window, just as the house's lights were being extinguished for the night. Their established signal brought her to the glass immediately, and even in the moonlight he could see the fear in her eyes. The note he threw up to her was longer than usual, cramped with urgent information. Beloved, tonight changes everything. G plans to kill us both within the week. Kansas Marshal arrives tomorrow, investigating his previous wives. We must act tonight or never. If you trust me, if you love me as I love you, be ready at midnight. Wear dark clothes. Bring only what you must have. I'm taking you away from here forever. Kahir's response came quickly, written on paper, torn from what looked like a Bible. My Duraris Kalanias to everything. I've been ready to leave since the day I was forced to marry him. I have evidence of his crimes hidden in my jewelry box papers. I stole from his desk weeks ago. God help us both. But I'd rather die free with you than live as his prisoner one more day. Your Vespered. The sight of his real name in her handwriting, the admission that she returned his love, gave him strength. For what came next? He rode back to his ranch to gather supplies and weapons, knowing that Grimwald's killers would be coming soon. But they wouldn't find the helpless victim they expected. They'd find a man who'd learned to kill efficiently in the war and had never forgotten the skills. As Kalen loaded his rifle and checked his sidearm, he thought about the irony of the situation. He'd spent months as a phantom, leaving secret messages like some romantic ghost. Tonight, he'd become something far more dangerous. Tonight, he'd become the avenging angel that Mordecai Grimwald had never seen coming. The clock on his mantle showed 11:30. In 30 minutes, he'd either be riding toward freedom with the woman he loved, or he'd be dead in the ruins of his home. Either way, the Phantom Letter Writer's war was about to begin in earnest. The first killer came through Kellen's front door at exactly midnight, confident and careless, expecting to find a sleeping rancher. Instead, he found a tripwire connected to a shotgun blast that sent him straight to whatever hell awaited men like him. Kalen watched from his position in the barn loft as the second assassin circled toward the back of the house, moving with the practiced stealth of a professional. Kalen had been professional too once upon a time, when Uncle Sam had needed men who could move like shadows and kill without hesitation. The war had ended 5 years ago, but apparently the war wasn't finished with him. He waited until the killer was perfectly positioned beneath the hayloft before dropping down silently behind him. The man's neck snapped with a sound like dry kindling, quick and efficient and regrettably necessary. That left one more the leader, who'd spoken with such casual brutality about burning down ranches and murdering innocent women. Kalen found him trying to set fire to the barn, a can of kerosene in one hand and a torch in the other, expecting someone else? Kellen's voice cut through the darkness as he stepped from the shadows. His Colt .45 trained on the killer's center. Mass, the man spun, going for his gun with the speed of someone who'd survived by being faster than his opponents. But he'd never faced a man who'd learned to shoot while Confederate bullets whistled past his ears, who'd practiced until drawing and firing became as natural as breathing. The killer's weapon had barely cleared. its holster when Kellen's bullet took him in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him into the hay he'd been trying to ignite. 3 men had come to murder him in his sleep. 3 men now lay dead on his property. And Kellen felt exactly as much remorse as he'd felt for every Confederate soldier he'd killed during the war. Which was to say, none at all. He gathered his pre-packed supplies money, weapons, spare clothes, and most importantly, the photographs he'd taken of Grimwald's incriminating documents. Then he saddled his fastest horse and rode hard toward town, knowing that he had perhaps an hour before Grimwald. Realized his hired killers weren't coming back. The Grimwald mansion sat like a Gothic nightmare against the star-filled sky. Towers and angles designed to intimidate rather than welcome. But Kellen had been inside during social functions, had memorized the layout during boring dinner parties, and all he could think about was the woman trapped in this architectural prison. Getting to Vespers, window required scaling the oak tree, whose branches nearly touched the house's second storia. Route he'd identified weeks ago during his Phantom Messenger campaign. Tonight, instead of carrying love letters, he carried weapons and the tools needed to free her permanently. She was waiting at the window, dressed in dark traveling clothes, with a small bag clutched in her hands. Even terrified and desperate, she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Kellen," she whispered as he helped her through the window onto the sturdy branch outside. "I heard gunshots from the direction of your ranch. Are you hurt?" "Sent 3 men to kill me tonight," he replied quietly, guiding her down through the branches with steady hands. "I won't be reporting back." Her eyes widened, but she didn't recoil from him. Instead, she reached up to touch his face with fingers that trembled only slightly. "You killed them? I defended myself." "There's a difference, is there?" The question wasn't accusatory, just curious, the inquiry of a woman trying to understand. The man she was trusting with her life. "There is to me." He helped her down from the tree, then led her quickly across the manicured grounds toward where his horse waited in the shadows. "Can you ride? Like the wind when I have to?" They were mounting his horse when the mansion's front door exploded open, and Mordecai Grimwald emerged with a lamp in one hand and a rifle in the other.
"Oh."
His expensive nightclothes were rumpled, his usually perfect hair disheveled with sleep and rage. "Vesper." His voice boomed across the night air. "Get back in this house immediately." Instead of obeying, she wrapped her arms around Kellen's waist and pressed close against his back. "Ride," she whispered urgently. "Ride as fast as you." But Grimwald was already raising his rifle, drawing a bead on Kellen's silhouette. At this range, even a mediocre shot could put a bullet through both of them. "You want to know about accidents, Grimwald?" Kellen called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Ask the marshal from Kansas City when he arrives tomorrow. Ask him about your previous wives." The rifle wavered slightly. "What are you talking about? Do you really think no one would notice the pattern? 3 young wives? 3 convenient deaths? 3 grieving widower stories that fooled everyone except the law." Kellen's hand moved to his saddlebags where the photographs waited as evidence. "I know everything, Mordecai. Every forged document. Every bribe, every murder you've committed in the name of business. You're bluffing. The hidden room behind your office fireplace says otherwise. It's amazing what a man can discover when he puts his mind to it." Oh, for a moment, the tableau held the fleeing lovers on horseback, the enraged husband with his weapon. The sleeping town spread between them like a chessboard, where lives hung in the balance. Then, "Sheriff." Blackthorn's voice cut through the tension like a cavalry saber through silk. "Drop the rifle, Grimwald." The lawman emerged from the shadows beside the mansion, his own weapon drawn and ready. Behind him came 2 other figures, a tall man with a federal marshal's badge gleaming on his vest, and Deputy Willis carrying enough firepower to stop a small army. "Marshal Henderson, Kansas City," the tall man announced. "Mordecai Grimwald, you're under arrest for the murders of Rebecca Grimwald, Catherine Grimwald, and Millicent Grimwald, along with various charges of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy." Grimwald's face went white as old bones. "This is ridiculous. Those women died of natural causes. Natural causes don't leave traces of arsenic in hair samples," Marshal Henderson replied coldly. "We've been investigating you for 6 months, Mr. Grimwald. We just needed enough evidence to make the charges stick." The rifle dropped from Grimwald's nerveless fingers, and Kellen knew the immediate danger had passed. But as he looked down at Vesper in his arms, her face turned up to his, with trust and love shining in her eyes, he realized that their real journey was just beginning. "Where do we go now?" she asked softly. "Anywhere you want," he replied, thinking of the wide world that lay beyond Silverdale County, as long as we go together. Behind them, Marshal Henderson was reading Mordecai Grimwald, his rights, while Sheriff Blackthorne secured the scene. The Phantom Letter Writers' War was finally over, but Galen Thornwick's love story was just beginning. 6 weeks later, Galen stood on the front porch of a small ranch house in Wyoming Territory, watching Vesper feed chickens in the morning sunlight. She wore a simple blue dress that had cost him $3 in the general store in Cheyenne. And she'd never looked more beautiful than she did, scattered with cornmeal and laughing at the antics of a particularly aggressive rooster. "You're staring again," she called, without looking up from her task. "Can't help it," he replied, settling into the rocking chair he'd built from lodgepole pine. "Still can't quite believe you're real." She dusted off her hands and walked toward him, her step light and easy in a way it had never been during her marriage to Grimwald. Freedom suited her like the Wyoming sunshine suited the endless grassland that stretched beyond their modest property. "Any regrets?" he asked as she settled into his lap, her arms winding around his neck with comfortable familiarity. About leaving everything behind, about becoming the wife of a wanted man, about living in a house with only 3 rooms and a leaky roof? She pretended to consider seriously. Not a single one. Technically, they weren't married yet. That would happen next week when the circuit preacher made his rounds through their part of the territory. But in every way that mattered, they were already husband and wife, bound together by love forged in desperate circumstances and tempered by their shared escape from Grimwald's murderous plans. The wanted posters had appeared 3 days after they'd fled Colorado, describing Galen as a dangerous fugitive suspected of murdering 3 men and kidnapping a prominent banker's wife. The rewards offered were substantial enough to interest bounty hunters from 3 territories. "Any word from Sheriff Blackthorne?" Vesper asked, noting the direction of his thoughts. Galen pulled a letter from his shirt pocket. Had arrived with the morning mail, bearing the official seal of Silverdale County. "Grimwald's trial started last week. Marshal Henderson thinks they have enough evidence to hang him twice over. The charges against you dropped. Turns out killing hired assassins in self-defense isn't considered murder when you have witnesses who can testify to the circumstances." He kissed her temple, breathing in the scent of sunshine and soap that had replaced the expensive perfumes Grimwald had forced her to wear. "We're free, Vesper, truly free." She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "Do you ever think about going back? Is your ranch your life in Colorado?" The question was carefully neutral, but he heard the deeper concern beneath it. She was asking if he resented the sacrifices he'd made for her, if he missed the prosperous life he'd abandoned to save them both. "That wasn't living," he said simply. "That was just existing." This he gestured toward their simple home, their modest acreage, their peaceful morning routine. "This is what I've been searching for without knowing it." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Kellen's hand moved instinctively toward his gun until he recognized the riders, their nearest neighbors. The McCready family, approaching with the easy pace of people bearing good news rather than trouble. "Morning, folks," called Duncan McCready, a weather-beaten Scotsman who'd taken them under his wing since their arrival. "Wanted to bring you word from town." Stage came through with newspapers from Colorado. That's why Flora was practically bouncing in her saddle with excitement. That awful banker fellow Grimwald, he's been convicted on all charges. Judge sentenced him to hang next month. The news hit Galen like a physical blow, not of sadness but of relief so profound it left him momentarily speechless.
"I'll wait for 6 weeks.
They'd been living with the knowledge that Grimwald might escape justice, might somehow use his money and influence to avoid the consequences of his crimes. "There's more," Duncan continued. "Seems like that hidden room you found contained evidence of other crimes too." Turns out Grimwald was part of a whole network of corrupt businessmen who've been cheating folks all across the territory. The federal marshals are having a field day, and Flora added with obvious delight. "They're talking about giving you some kind of reward for exposing the whole mess." Hero of the territory, they're calling you in the Denver papers. Hero Kalen almost laughed at the irony. For months, he'd been a phantom, a shadow figure, leaving secret messages in the darkness. Now he was being hailed as a champion of justice, simply for refusing to let the woman he loved be murdered by a madman. "There's something else," Duncan said, his tone growing more serious. "Your old ranch foreman fellow named Jasper, he's been taking care of your property since you left. Says the cattle are thriving and the books are in good order. He's hoping you might consider coming back." Kalen felt Vesper tense in his arms, and he knew she was thinking the same thing he was. They could go back. They could reclaim his prosperous ranch, live in comfort and security, be celebrated as heroes instead of hiding as fugitives. But as he looked around their humble homestead, the vegetable garden Vesper had planted, the barn he'd built with his own hands, the simple life they'd created together, he realized he didn't want prosperity if it came at the cost of peace. "Tell Jasper to sell the ranch," he said finally. "Use the money to buy land for any of the hands who want to start their own spreads. The rest can go to the territorial orphanage." "Kalen," Vesper protested softly, "that ranch was your life's work." "No," he corrected, pulling her closer. "You're my life's work. Everything else is just details." The Macredis exchanged a look. That spoke of 30 years of marriage, of understanding that some things matter more than money or status or public recognition. "We'll pass along your instructions," Duncan said simply, "and we'll be honored to stand as witnesses at your wedding next week." As their neighbors rode away, Kalen and Vesper sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher in the endless Wyoming sky. Somewhere in Colorado, a corrupt banker awaited execution for his crimes. Somewhere else, the phantom letter writer was being remembered as a hero. But here, in this moment, there were simply two people who'd found love in impossible circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of their previous lives. "Do you think we'll be happy here?" Vesper asked, leaning back against his shoulder. "I think," Kalen replied, "that happiness isn't a place you find. It's something you create with the people you love." In the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song to the morning air, and Vesper hummed along the same melody that had caught his attention at the Harvest Festival so many months ago. Before her father's debts had stolen her freedom, and before love had given it back again. The wedding took place at sunset on a hillside overlooking their small ranch. With wildflowers instead of formal decorations and the entire Wyoming sky serving as their cathedral ceiling, Vesper wore her mother's dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame, while Kalen stood beside her in his best suit, the same one he'd worn to countless social functions where he'd watched her from across crowded rooms, never dreaming she might someday be his. Circuit Preacher Williams had arrived that morning with news from the outside world, including a telegram that changed everything. "It seems like you folks have been vindicated in the most official way possible," the elderly minister announced as the small gathering of neighbors assembled for the ceremony. Governors issued a full pardon for any actions taken in the course of exposing the Grimwald conspiracy. There's even talk of a commendation. But Kalen barely heard the words about pardons and commendations. All his attention was focused on Vesper as she walked toward him through the gathered wildflowers, her face radiant with the kind of joy that had been missing from her life for far too long. "Dearly beloved," Preacher Williams began, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The vows they spoke were traditional, but the words carried weight earned through hardship, through desperate midnight escapes, and the kind of love that had survived impossible odds." When Kalen promised to love and cherish her for better or worse, he was thinking of lantern signals in the darkness and the courage it had taken to trust a phantom messenger. When Vesper promised to honor and keep him, she was remembering the moment she'd chosen freedom over security, love over safety. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced. And when Kellen's lips met hers, the small crowd erupted in cheers that echoed across the rolling grassland. The celebration that followed was simple, but joyful, a feast prepared by their neighbors. Fiddle music that drew couples into dancing beneath the emerging stars. The kind of genuine happiness that had nothing to do with wealth or social position. But the real celebration came later. when they were finally alone in their small house. Husband and wife at last, after months of stolen moments and secret messages. "Mrs. Thornwick," Kaylin said, testing the sound of her new name. "I like how that sounds," she replied, moving into his arms with the easy grace of a woman who no longer had to hide her feelings. "Though I have to admit, I'll miss our secret correspondence. Will you?" He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "Then you might enjoy this." She opened it to find his familiar handwriting, but instead of the desperate messages they'd once exchanged. This letter was filled with promises for their future dreams of children running through their meadows, of growing old together on this land they'd claimed with their love, of a life built on honesty rather than hidden in shadows. "You wrote me another letter," she said, wonder in her voice. "The first of many, I hope, though from now on I won't need lanterns to deliver them." Their wedding night was everything their stolen moments had promised and more tender and passionate. Desperate and gentle, the physical expression of emotions too powerful for words. For the first time in either of their lives, they could love completely without fear, without watching over their shoulders for discovery or death. As dawn broke over their small ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Vesper traced lazy patterns on Kellen's chest with her fingertip. "Do you think he would have approved?" she asked softly. Kaylin didn't need to ask who she meant. Henrik Nightingale's ghost had haunted both of them, the gambling father whose debts had started this entire tragic chain of events. "I think," Kaylin said carefully, "that your father loved you enough to want you to be happy, even if he made terrible choices that nearly destroyed that possibility." "He wasn't always a gambler," she said quietly. "Before my mother died, he was different. The cards were just his way of trying to numb the pain, I suppose." "Pain makes people do desperate things," Kaylin agreed, thinking of his own desperate measures to reach her during those dark months of her marriage to Grimwald. "The important thing is that love survived despite all the mistakes." It's 3 months later, they received a letter that brought news both expected and surprising. Mordecai Grimwald had been executed as scheduled, but his death had revealed the final piece of a puzzle that stretched far beyond their small corner of Colorado. "Listen to this," Vesper said, reading aloud from Sheriff Blackthorn's careful handwriting. Grimwald's execution was attended by representatives from 6 different territories, all investigating similar patterns of fraud and murder. Turns out, our friend was part of an organized criminal network that stretched from Kansas to California, and the other members being rounded up one by one, thanks to the evidence you photographed from his secret room. Marshall Henderson says you've helped solve at least a dozen murders and probably saved dozens of other young women from Grimwald's fate. Kaylin absorbed this information with mixed feelings. He was glad that justice was being served, that other innocents would be spared Vesper's ordeal. But he was also grateful that their part in the larger drama was finished, that they could build their life without constantly looking over their shoulders. "There's more," Vesper continued. "The territorial government is offering you a position as a federal investigator. Working with marshals to expose corruption throughout the West, the pay would be substantial, and we could live anywhere we chose." The offer was tempting in its way, a chance to do important work, to prevent other women from suffering as Vesper had suffered. But as Kaylin looked around their simple home, at the life they'd built with their own hands, he knew his answer. "Write to Sheriff Blackthorn," he said. "Tell him I'm honored by the offer, but I've already found my calling, which is you," he said simply, "raising our children on this land, building something that will last long after we're gone." She smiled, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat belly where their first child was just beginning to grow, a secret they'd shared for only a week, but one that made their future feel as vast and promising as the Wyoming sky. "Our children will grow up hearing this story," she said, "about their father, the phantom letter writer, who risked everything to save their mother from a monster. Our children will grow up knowing that love can overcome anything," Kaylin corrected. "That's the only lesson that really matters." As evening fell over their ranch, they sat together on the porch swing Kaylin had built as a wedding gift, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, other couples were facing their own impossible odds, their own desperate circumstances. But here in this place, they'd made their own. Love had triumphed over every obstacle. The phantom letter writer had finally delivered his most important message, that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with guns or gold, but with the simple courage to refuse to give up on love. 10 years later, Kalen stood on the same hillside where he'd married Vesper, but now he wasn't alone. 3 children played in the wildflowers at his feet, twin boys aged 8 with their mother's copper hair, their father's steel gray eyes, and a 6-year-old daughter whose laugh could charm the birds from the trees. "Papa, tell us about the lantern man again," little Rosalind demanded, tugging on his coat with the persistence that had made her the unofficial leader of her older brothers. "You've heard that story 100 times, Kalen protested, though his tone held nothing but indulgence. "But we want to hear it again," chorused the twins, Marcus and Matthew, abandoning their game of cowboys and outlaws to cluster around their father. From the house below, Vesper's voice carried on the evening breeze as she called them in for supper. At 34, she was even more beautiful than the girl he'd fallen in love with, maturity and motherhood having added depth to her beauty without diminishing its power to stop his heart. "One more time," Kalen agreed, settling onto a fallen log while his children arranged themselves around him. "But this is the last telling before supper. Once upon a time," he began, using the traditional opening that made even true stories feel like fairy tales, "there was a rancher who loved a girl he could never have, because she was sold to the bad man," Rosalind added, having memorized every detail of the story. "That's right. And because he couldn't speak to her directly, he became a phantom, a shadow, who left secret messages in the darkness." As he told the familiar tale, Kalen found himself thinking about how much their world had changed. The Wyoming Territory had become a state 3 years ago, bringing law and order to what had once been wild frontier. Their ranch had grown from 160 acres to nearly 2,000, making them one of the most prosperous families in the county. The railroad had come through 5 years back, connecting their isolated valley to the greater world beyond. But the most significant change was inside their home, where love had grown and multiplied, creating a family that was the true measure of their success. "And then what happened, Papa?" Marcus prompted, though he knew the answer by heart. "Then the phantom realized that some battles can't be won by hiding in shadows. Sometimes love requires courage enough to step into the light. So he saved Mama from the monster," Matthew concluded with satisfaction. "We saved each other," Kalen corrected gently, a lesson he tried to teach them with every telling. Love isn't about one person rescuing another. It's about 2 people choosing to face the world together. "Kalen Thornwick." Vesper's voice held mock sternness as she appeared at the bottom of the hill. "If you don't bring those children down for supper right now, I'm going to eat all the apple pie myself." The threat of missing dessert galvanized the children into action, and they raced down the hillside like wild ponies, leaving their parents to follow at a more dignified pace. "Still telling them about the phantom letter writer?" Vesper asked, slipping her hand into his as they walked. "They never get tired of hearing it." "That's because it's a love story," she replied. "And everyone loves a good love story, especially when it's their parents." As they reached the house, now expanded to 8 rooms, with a proper parlor and a library filled with books ordered from back east, Kalen paused to look back at the hillside where they'd been married, where their children now played, where he'd first dared to dream of a life beyond his desperate phantom existence. "Any regrets?" he asked, the same question they'd posed to each other countless times over the years. "Only one," Vesper said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I regret that I didn't throw myself out of that window and run away with you the very first night you appeared with a lantern. It would have made for a much shorter story, but no less romantic." Inside their home buzzed with the comfortable chaos of family life. The children chattered about their day lessons with their mother, chores with their father, adventures exploring the creek that ran through their property. The dining room table, built from local pine and expanded twice to accommodate their growing family, groaned under the weight of Vesper's cooking. After supper, as they did every evening, the family gathered in the parlor for what they called letter time. Kalen would read aloud from the newspapers that arrived weekly on the train, sharing news from the wider world. Then Vesper would read from whatever book they were currently enjoying tonight. It was Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, which had arrived in the latest shipment from the Denver bookstore. But the tradition that the children loved most came at the very end. When Kalen would produce a letter he'd written that day, sometimes to Vesper, sometimes to each of the children, individually, sometimes to the family as a whole. These weren't desperate messages hidden in darkness, but celebrations of their daily life together, chronicles of small victories and quiet joys. "This one's for all of us," he announced, unfolding the evening's composition. "My dearest family, today marks exactly 10 years since your mother and I were married on the hill above our home. In those 10 years, we've built something I never thought possible, a love that grows stronger with each passing season, a family that fills every corner of our lives with laughter and purpose." He paused, looking around at their faces, Vesper's eyes soft with remembered happiness. The children's expressions rapt with attention and felt the same overwhelming gratitude that had sustained him through every challenge they'd faced. The phantom letter writer began his work in desperation. He continued reading, leaving messages in the darkness because he was afraid to speak his love aloud. But real love isn't hidden or desperate or afraid. Real love builds homes and raises children and faces each new day with confidence that, whatever comes, it will be faced together. I love you all more than words can express. And I promise to keep writing these letters for as long as I draw breath, because some messages are too important to trust to memory alone. As applause filled the parlor within, the smallest children had learned to appreciate their father's evening letters. Kalen folded the paper and added it to the growing collection in the family Bible. Someday, when his children were grown and had families of their own, these letters would remind them of the love that had built their world. Later, after the children had been tucked into their beds with kisses and bedtime stories, Kalen and Vesper sat together on their front porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. "Do you think they understand how extraordinary our story really is?" Vesper asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "They will when they're older, and they face their own impossible choices and need to remember that love can overcome anything, even phantom letter writers and murderous bankers. Especially phantom letter writers and murderous bankers." And the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, carrying new dreamers toward their own destinies. But here, in this place they'd claimed with their love and defended with their courage. Kalen and Vesper Thornwick had found something more precious than gold or fame or public recognition. They'd found home. As they prepared to go inside, Vesper paused at the door. "Kalen, thank you for what? For being brave enough to step out of the shadows, for choosing love over safety, for giving me a life I never dared to dream of." He pulled her into his arms, marveling as he did every day at the miracle of holding her freely, openly, without fear or shame or the need for secrecy. "Thank you," he replied, "for being worth every risk I ever took." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, blessing a love that had begun with desperate messages in the darkness and had grown into something as enduring as the mountains themselves. The phantom letter writer's war was long over, but the love story he'd fought for would continue for generations yet to come. In the parlor, 3 children slept peacefully in their beds, dreaming of adventures and love stories of their own. And in the master bedroom, their parents held each other close, grateful for every twist of fate that had brought them together and confident that whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it as they had faced everything else together.